Hello everyone and welcome to Let's Talk HR. Today we're going to try and take on the difficult conversations topic and how to prepare yourself, the mindset, your essential communication skills, and just basically give you some tools and tips as to how you can approach those difficult conversations, because for some reason it gives everyone anxiety. Everyone starts to panic that what if I get it wrong, what if I do wrong, and then you read horror stories online, you're like, oh my God, and then it gets even worse. And so to sort of navigate through this, you've got myself and you've got Natalie Ellis from Reeboks HR with you today. Natalie, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you, James. How are you doing?
I'm good. Less tech issues than you, it seems. However, my website went down and your webcam wasn't working properly. So, it's not really difficult conversation. It's just difficult technology. But yeah, I'm good. I guess we should probably start, if we're going to talk about difficult conversations, any conversation can be difficult if it's harder for you. But when we're talking about difficult conversations, probably what we're focusing on is bad news, or delivering bad news, or talking about something that's going to make potentially someone else upset or something like that. What do you think of what do you define as difficult conversations, Natalie?
I think as humans, we generally don't like difficult conversations. We will naturally try and avert conflict as much as possible through those very reasons that you've said, such as making somebody feel upset, maybe not make them feel good about themselves, or the worst one that most people fear is around criticism and how that is received, accepted, and then handled by the individual receiving it. So one of the biggest things that we work with and the biggest challenge for managers is actually how do we approach the conversation in the first place. So the real challenge around that, and the way to kind of get over that hurdle, would be to plan and prepare that conversation long before it takes place. There's nothing worse than going in and just pulling the pin and going steaming in. It doesn't really, it never works out well when you take that kind of tack with these situations. So yeah, it's an incredibly cringeworthy conversation that people just generally avoid. But if they do avoid it and they just sweep it under the carpet, it's only going to get worse.
There's nothing worse, is there, than you think you've done something right, and then out of nowhere, bosh, no, you've done it all completely wrong, just because it ruins your sort of fabric of belief of what you've been doing. So I think people need to be prepared, and I think organizations need to start to think about a continuous feedback culture, both positive and negative, and that's a good thing. If you're getting negative feedback, if you're failing, it's good, because failure is a natural part of learning. But also just being more comfortable being uncomfortable is, I think, really important, especially for new leaders and new managers. And you obviously work with, small business owners, medium-sized business owners that are going through, probably sometimes for the first time, these types of situations, and they're probably feeling uncomfortable, feeling anxious, worried about what the potential outcomes would be. What's your approach to sort of just saying to someone, right, okay, well, let's just take emotion out of it and build it up? Or do you just start writing everything down and then form a plan of attack?
I think I can answer that in two parts. So we get two types of client. We get the ones that really don't want to have the conversation, and the ones that are a little bit Tasmanian devil approach, shall we say. And they come in and they're like, this person's done this again. It doesn't surprise me. And they've not done anything about it at this point. It's essential to point out. And then they're like, they've done this again. And it's almost like a surprise to them. But it also, in some ways, can feel very much like it's some sort of personal attack on them, and that they're doing this to them, which is often how we then have to take the heat out of these conversations. So Faye and I will, we'd rather the client have that conversation with us and not say anything to the employee at this point, because it becomes too emotive. And when you've got the emotional side that comes out, it all becomes very opinionated, it becomes very personal. And that's when that almost personal attack and the toing and froing then comes into it, which causes the one that we really want to avoid, which is the conflict at work. The best way of being able to approach any difficult conversation is to plan what you're going to say. And as I've said to many clients in the past, is that actually it's best if you have a moment to be able to take that time to write down what it is that you want to say. And it has to be factual. We don't, if they say, oh, well, they've been off sick again. Okay, right. Well, then tell me how many times they've been off sick. Tell me what the occasions were, what the reasons were. And then you're able to arm yourself with a conversation. You can go in and say, right, we're not happy with your level of absence, employee A. We really want to try and reduce this. Is there anything that we should be doing, or is there anything that, you could be doing to improve your absence at work? Just taking that as a really basic example. But by having that information in front of you, you're going to feel more comfortable with the uncomfortable. And that's realistically what we do day in, day out here at Revox.
Yeah, and one of my favourite quotes that I say to people is, react in haste, repent at leisure. Because if you don't understand what's gone wrong, if you don't understand what they're needing to do, if you haven't sort of built that picture out fully, as you've said, okay, they're off sick, but how many times have they been off sick? What is the pattern? What is this? If you just react and do something, then what we mean by repenting at leisure is you could do something that would be unfair dismissal, not done in the correct way, bullying and harassment. You may actually have unconscious biases and prejudices in your head that just need to be challenged. And when I start to think about how you prepare for these types of difficult conversations, a lot of it for me comes to the probably more the HR analytical side, which is, okay, well, what data have we got? I get this is how you feel. That's fine. But what data have we got? Is this the most sick person? Is this just someone that you don't like? And if that is the case, many of the times it is, that's okay, as long as you're aware of it and we're aware of it. And then we can talk about, well, actually, how do you help this person, as opposed to how do you just create barriers? So when I start to think about preparation, I'm not a great one for planning what I'm going to say. I just tend to go, but I do have data. I think that's my script in this instance. I will have data and I'll go, I've looked at this, and I've looked at this, and these are the types of things that this data is telling me. What do you think about them? These are the concerns that the business has, and then we sort of start to build it up from that preparation. So I'm probably a little bit more data preparation. I say a little bit more. Obviously, you're still very data preparation because I know what you're like. And then I'll sort of free the conversation and allow sort of a two-way with that data. What do you give them any strategies for staying calm in these types of situations? Because it can become very accusatory, can't it? And I don't really have any sort of technique I can say to people to just go, well, count to 5 every time they say something you don't like. I've got no way of sort of reining people in. Is there anything you do?
Yeah, one of the things that surprises clients when we work with them, we always say to them, let the employee do the talking. You've done your preparation, you've got your questions in front of you, but it's all relative to whoever we're working with, to be honest, because some clients it works with, others it doesn't. We ultimately cannot control what happens in that meeting, because whether you're present or whether you're virtual, the line manager or the client or whoever the chair of the meeting is, they're going to do whatever it is that they're going to do, whether HR is present or not. And I think we always have to be aware of that scope of control. And we often spoke about that, I think, in our previous ones as to what our Let's Talk HR episodes, where we can only be responsible for our own actions. We can give the advice, we can lead the horse to water, but whether they choose to drink or not is a different thing. So we do have to make sure that as HR practitioners, we're not actually taking it personally. And the point that you made a moment ago about the evidence-based side of things, that is where the strength of the conversation comes from. You can't argue with what the facts are telling you. So we recently saw a case where an employee was, I believe they were unfairly dismissed. I'll have to get the case and pop it in the chat. But they were unfairly dismissed, and they said, well, actually, the overall basis of the case is that they didn't have the data and the evidence behind it, and they hadn't investigated the particular case thoroughly. And this is where, as HR professionals, we can't rely upon our existing knowledge. We have to look at casework. We need to look at what tribunal hearings and results are coming out looking like. We can't afford in this day and age to rest on our laurels at all. We have to look at what is actually going out in the space, because it is changing so quickly, and how people wish to identify changes quickly, and how, you know, the world of work isn't as it was when I first started out in HR 17 years ago. It has changed dramatically over the past 3 years. I can honestly say it's a very different workplace now. And, you know, when you're going into these conversations, you have to make sure that you're dealing with whatever situation very sensitively. You can't just go, right, you've done this wrong, you've done that wrong, and this is how you've got to fix it, and this is what we expect of you. Now, employers can say what they are expecting of those employees, because managing expectations, boundaries, and being very clear with the direction that you want to manage that person is absolutely essential. But what you're now seeing is that there's a whole world of stuff that's going on, and that the employee's going to bring their own emotions into that meeting. They don't want to be there any more than what you do. Whatever side of the table you're on, they don't want to be there, you don't want to be there. But then you have to bring it back to that core reason as to why you are there. So once you keep it back to that, then you're able to have a constructive conversation. If we've got our Tasmanian devil going in there, he's going to, or she is going to be, pointing, they're going to be accusing that person, they're going to have a very strong opinion, they're lazy, they don't pick up as much work as the people sat next to them. All of these things start to conjure up how what their own opinion is, and that's a dangerous situation that we're in. And that also presents a significant risk to our businesses as well. So if we do have a Tasmanian devil, what I tend to do is get them to call me, and the Tasmanian devil will absolutely rant. Usually it's between half an hour, 45, an hour. The longest one that I've had is 2.5 hours so far.
Oh.
And that allows the client to let that pressure off, because I would rather, as a HR person, that they were, I will be honest, James, they can be as, un-PC to me, they can rant and rave, they've got to let that energy go somewhere, because if they don't, then you'll find that will then go straight to the employee, and then you've got a grievance and a whole world of hurt as a HR practitioner to deal with. If a line manager can be open and honest with you and say, Natalie, James, I'm not happy, and this is the reason why I'm not happy, this is what my thoughts are, this is what I want to do, and I know I can't do that, but I really want to. If you're letting them have their own safe space, because what you have to remember with managers is that they have pressure from underneath with the people they're managing, and you have pressure from the top down. So they don't have a traditional safe space that an employee would have, or access to support that perhaps directors of a business would have. I'm not saying everyone has access to it, but generally we're much more aware now, and we have that. But in these circumstances, we need to have that in mind. And as HR practitioners, we can't go in there and be judgmental and say, well, Mr. Line Manager, what you're doing is wrong. There's a constructive way of us having that conversation too. So HR, if you're not used to having difficult conversations, it is an area that you need to get comfortable with, because the way that the employment space is going, that's the demand for that is only going to increase as we see the complexities of employing people evolve. I think that's what we're going to see over the next few months.
Yeah, it's probably worth pointing out at this moment, it's really easy to use examples of people who've done something wrong in work for difficult conversations, because they're the ones that everyone thinks about. But there are things like bonuses, reward, visas, contract extensions, whole ideas and initiatives that you're going to let down and you're not going to do, things you're going to pause, invest, ideas of other people that you're going to go with as opposed to their idea. All these can be really difficult conversations that can build up a lot of anxiety in a person. It's not always end of career type thing, and it's fine that you start to feel like that. One of the pieces of advice I always give to people is, what do you want to do? How do you want to approach it? Okay. Take the evening to reflect on it, see if anything feels different in the morning, because you'd be surprised what going home, getting more of that energy out at a partner, a dog, a gym, whatever you do to sort of redirect your energy. And by a partner, I mean talk. I don't mean like the gym, like punching it.
Yep, don't do that.
I just mean chatting to someone completely impartial.
But James said it's okay. No, put a disclaimer on this one, James.
Yeah. But just redirecting that energy and then taking some time to sleep, take the emotion out of it, come back in the morning and think, well, actually, that makes sense. So sometimes taking the evening can be one of the biggest things that you can do in terms of positive impacts for difficult conversations. But it can be really hard. Sometimes you want to extend someone's visa, you want to do all the paperwork, but unfortunately you can't because of legal requirements or anything like that. Sometimes you want to give someone more of a bonus because you know how much stress and pressure they're under, but the business hasn't performed well enough and you'll feel guilty about it because of X, Y, and Z reasons. And all these things are difficult conversations where, if they're not approached in the right way, can disengage staff, disengage engagement, create more problems down the road. Because if you, for example, think someone deserves a little bit more of a bonus or a little bit more of a commission, but they haven't done enough for it, and you tell them that, they're going to feel more down, they're going to feel more dejected, they're going to feel less valuable. Whereas if you can build them up and you can go, you didn't get this, but we are going to work together and make sure that it happens next month, then they're attacking it in a positive frame of mind. They're like, we're going to work together and we're going to make this happen. So preparation and mindfulness of what you want out of the situation is key when it comes to difficult conversations, because you might think they're difficult. The employer might think it's really simple because they know I've not hit the money for this. And you can create a difficult situation just by your lack of preparation.
Yeah.
Now, we'll move on next. Next on the list is about essential communication skills. One of the ones I always go to is removing the person from it and just talking about, well, what the data is saying is this, what this is saying is this, and being very factual about the information, as opposed to going, what you have done, and I try and remove you and me from all conversations. Go, well, what the data is saying, what this is saying, what this evidence has said is. So I'm not blaming them. I'm not blaming me. I'm not putting myself up and pushing them down. What I'm saying is, this information is telling me this, which will lead to this. Yeah. What about you? What are some of your key communication skills when it comes to difficult conversations?
I think it's quite easy, no matter how much you plan to go into these conversations. One of the major or one of the most common conversations that we get at the moment is very much this opinion of somebody's attitude. And that's very difficult to quantify with data because, again, it's very opinionated. But if you have facts or incidences that have actually happened, that will then allow you to go in and have that constructive conversation in the first place. Like you said, you have to focus on the positives. But one of the one of the best ways to have this conversation, I mentioned it earlier, was to allow the opportunity for the employee to speak. Because sometimes managers will go in and they will just want this conversation over with. So they'll go in, they've got their script, they've got their points and everything else, and they'll go straight in, they'll go, blah, 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 blah. So what do you think about that? And the employee sat there going, I don't know how to respond, because they've had so much information at one time, they've not had the opportunity to support or, to say what it is that they need to be able to help resolve the situation. So actively listening is probably one of the key points that you absolutely need in these conversations, because people, the brain is wired in a way sometimes where it doesn't want to hear the negative points. So if the employee says, well, actually, I would prefer to be managed better, in XYZ ways. Now, the manager's not going to take that very well, because they're going to then have that reflect on them. It's about having that confidence to have the conversation in the first place. Now, it sounds really strange that you're going to have a difficult conversation, but you have to be confident with it. And it's actually, you're not going in there for no reason. It comes back to that core reason why you're having the conversation. So once you have that foundation there, you can then bring in the communication piece. How am I going to say this to them? And, how do I allow them to have that space to feel comfortable enough to tell me what they honestly think? And employee voice at the moment is incredibly powerful. You're seeing companies all over the place offering engagement surveys, and also you're seeing a lot of engagement strategies now, as opposed to it just being the annual survey that you get in your inbox and you just tick off the bits that you think are worthwhile. So I do think that with having that in mind, it's very much a two-way conversation. And the way that I was trained when I was doing my level 7, for example, is that, the employee does 80% of the speaking, and then the employer does 20% of the speaking. And it's a rule that I've generally stuck with, because the more information you have, the more knowledge you have to be able to do something about it and work collaboratively. So it's not about being personal, it's about resolving, sometimes it'll be a complete misunderstanding of how someone's interpreted a task versus how it's done and how the manager sees it. So again, things like even the clear communication from the company is how do we expect to speak to each other? Do we have core values that we adhere to? So all of this stuff really comes into play, and it does depend very much upon the culture of the organisation. So yes, it's if people aren't comfortable with communication skills, again, it's something that can be trained. It's just taking the time to understand what it is that you're trying to get to.
And I'm going to go back to one of the points you made, because I think this is probably, if you're new to difficult conversations, or if you're planning for them for the first time, you mentioned active listening. You've got to remember, you, the manager and the HR person, you've been prepping for this for a day, 24 hours, something like that. As Natalie mentioned earlier, people have ranted for up to 2.5 hours, which is a spectacular record. This employee is probably hearing what you're about to say, whilst they might know a difficult conversation's coming. This is the first time they're hearing it. So active listening, telling them, have I understood this right? Actually putting some effort in to make sure that the point that they're trying to make is not only heard, but understood. By actively listening, confirming it back to them. Is this what you mean by this? Is this, so you want to be managed better? Can you explain what you mean by being managed better? Is it the one-to-one engagement? Is it regularity? By helping them get their point across and being an active listener, you're helping all the communication of the situation. And remember, you've got to try and help them, because you've had time to prep this and they haven't. And it's just such an important point I find with active listening, which is just, you're there as a HR professional to help the employee also get their voice heard and understood, not just there to sort of help the line manager get their point across and understood. You're there to help both sides. Now, one's had time to prep, the other hasn't. So you'd really need to be more in the moment in terms of how you communicate that other person's side of things. And it may be a black and white data piece, but there may be extenuating circumstances that they're struggling to articulate, and you may be able to help them in that instance. Now, strategies for resolution is the next that we've got on our list. What are some of the strategies you've got for these types of situations, where probably you need more mediation than you do end solution? How do you approach that type of situation, Natalie?
So we mediate quite a lot. especially in conflict situations where managers' relationships with employees perhaps have broken down, or in some cases I've been between two directors or two business owners. So these aren't easy situations.
One on each phone, just like, yeah.
I actually go to site for these. I always do mediation face to face, unless there is a substantial reason as to why they can't meet face to face. So for medical reasons, etc. So we, part of that is putting people at ease and creating that. I'm not really a fan of the term safe space, but it's probably the only way that I can describe that. So it allows them the opportunity to both be heard by each other. If it's in extreme circumstances with, director to director, they're very strong characters. They have to be within the positions that they're in. So having to mediate between two directors is probably the most challenging for me on a professional level, purely because I find that we have to adjourn a lot more and say, right, okay, but we're going to take a break. You go get yourself a tea and we'll have a chat one-on-one, and then we'll swap it around for the next one. So that we're, I'm being consistent and fair across the meeting itself. So when we're going into those situations, it is very, very challenging. It's not easy. And yes, we do have a level of prep, but nothing can prepare you for when you actually are having that conversation. So it's essentially HR's role is to kind of control that conversation without controlling it, which is strange. But it's the only way it can be described. So you allow one person to have that, to say their point of view, and allow the other person to listen and respond. So yes, it does kind of feel like a parent and child situation in these circumstances.
I like to go with the umpire in a tennis match.
Yes, it does feel like it does. Very Wimbledon. So yes, it can be very much like that. And you don't want to be in that role, but sometimes there's not an alternative. You have to be the impartial party. You have to give people consistency and fairness. And especially if you're dealing with conflict when it comes to employee management relations, because they break down so easily. Once those relationships are fractured, it's very difficult to bring it back, because you'll often find that, yes, they say that it's all resolved in that meeting at the end, but when they walk away, those feelings can bubble under the surface. There's no amount of reassurance or support or otherwise that you can give these individuals that would then make that feeling go away. Either they're going to take back the criticism on board and they're going to work with it constructively, or they're going to say, that manager or that employee is out to get me. I'm not saying that everyone's out to get each other, but it is one of those where it can come across that way, and it will feel like that. Again, it's the personal element to it. So being constructive and evidence and factual throughout these conversations is the only way that you can have a constructive conversation. If you start bringing in thoughts and feelings, then that brings in the emotion side of it, and that can essentially break that conversation down even further. So it's a balancing act all the time. One
of my favorite things to do when things do start to go a little bit more thoughts and feelings. Oh, that's difficult to say. Is to Everest the conversation. So if you can identify the commonality, what is the goal that they both want to achieve? It may be, business performance. It may be this. It may be that. Especially if there's no direct resolution. If you can find the flag in the sand they're both trying to get to, then you start to have the conversation around, well, how do you think we're going to get there? What do you think we're going to do to get? And they start almost giving their thoughts and feelings about how we can get to a goal. And it may not be the same, but they'll both compromise eventually about how we can get there, or they'll both find more things normally that they agree upon than they disagree upon. And they may be disagreeing on 2 or 3 things, but there's actually 10 things that they do agree on. And then from a HR perspective, our job becomes a lot easier, because instead of arguing about this person's terrible, this person's horrendous, what we're actually talking about is well, actually, if we did more digital marketing and less paper marketing, we would be more successful. And it just feels a lot less personal, a lot more thing, but they're getting to that goal. And sometimes people don't even understand the reason as to why they've fallen out. But I always find if there's a common goal, then you can start to build them together towards that common goal. And that's a great strategy for resolution, because nobody wants to fail, basically. Everyone wants to be as successful as they possibly can be.
Yeah. But we succeed through failure. So even if people do get it wrong, then you find different ways of being able to manage that. And sometimes it's a lot more effective if we fail. I know that I can't tell you how many times I've failed in my career. It is one of the things that I blog about a lot and I talk a lot about. It's we shouldn't fear that concept of failure. So if people are listening to this and or watching us on LinkedIn or wherever you prefer to get your podcasts, what we do have is a situation where people aren't always they're too scared of getting it wrong, and that completely skews the meeting. Again, you'll then get the manager going in with shaking hands and a piece of paper. That terrifies the employee on the other side of the table, because they're thinking, oh my gosh, this must be really bad. They're shaking like a leaf. And I've been in many meetings with managers where I've said, look, you know, the worst thing you can do in that scenario is offer them a coffee. Don't give them any caffeine whatsoever. Just give them a glass of water and allow them a few minutes to compose themselves. Because a lot of what we do in HR is coaching people. And if we make them fear failure and not embrace mistakes so that they get it better next time, it creates that blame culture that you were talking about earlier. And that's not constructive. It's not helpful, and it certainly doesn't positively impact a culture, especially in the workplace. So, yeah.
Now, I'm going to give you another solution, which I think is really beneficial, but I'm going to get you to talk about it instead of me talking about it, which is the benefit of a timeout and just sort of getting both parties away from a situation. How do you use timeouts when you're trying to do resolutions and stuff like that?
Again, depends on the circumstances. So, for example, one of my clients had a big restructure at the beginning of this year. They weren't sure if it was the right thing to do for their business. They've been umming and ahhing, and we've been in discussion for about 3 weeks about it. This is just in the prep stage, because they were losing clients. They weren't in a particularly good space. And from a morale perspective and the work that they do as an organisation, it was evident to the employees that something was wrong. So we couldn't really take our sweet time about it. We needed to make some really difficult decisions for that business. And, you know, when we're working with HR strategies, then, you know, difficult decisions do have to be made. And all we can do is advise to the best of our knowledge with the information that we're given. So when I met with the business owner and the managing director, we sat down and we went through it all, and they both were in disagreement. They didn't agree between the pair of them as to what the best course of action was going to be. So I've said, look, if you don't make a decision soon, there will not be a company left, and you will effectively be insolvent. And again, that's a really horrible message for someone from the outside looking in to deliver, is that you will be insolvent if you do not look at how we turn this around. The only way we can do this is to restructure and enable your employees to be able to continue in their roles, just in a different capacity. So we had a look at absolutely everything. So every role, every costing, absolutely the works. And the long and short of it was is that they still couldn't agree. After, you know, a 6.5 hour meeting, we still didn't have an agreement at the end. So I suggested to them, look, we're going to have to leave this and walk away. And I don't want you to speak to each other over the weekend. I don't want you to make any contact or discuss work with each other. Laptops off, the works. And they said, well, we're not used to doing that. And I said, it's out of your comfort zone, but unless you have clarity, you're not going to make the right decision. So getting them to walk away and effectively sleep on it over a weekend was a really it was a turning point throughout that process, because by the time we came back together on the Monday afternoon, they said, yeah, we know we've got to make this decision. We didn't want to because we're leading with our heart, not our head. And it's not best for the employees. We're acting in our own selfish capacities because we don't want to see the company change. And resistance to change is a really, really big thing, especially when we're having difficult conversations, because once that conversation is happening, things change. So I think there has to be a level of acceptance when we are looking at these things, because it's inevitable. As I mentioned earlier, things are changing at such a pace now that we need to be mindful as to how, the actual operations of companies work. And, in HR, HR's always become secondary to what we do. Yes, we know the processes and everything, but the main part is knowing that business and its people and the personalities that work in there. So I work with over 100 clients throughout the UK, and I know most of the employees that work for every single company that we work with. And it's not because I'm nosy. I mean, obviously, being nosy in HR definitely has its benefits, but it is one of those where it's really important to know those people, and so that you know what the challenges are potentially you're going to come up against, but also that you can relay the message in a way that works for that business. Having a blanket script doesn't work for every single business. You have to be aware of your audience. So yeah, I know that's a really long-winded answer, James, but it is one of those where it always depends. And I hate using the typical HR "it depends" argument, but it can't be avoided.
Whilst I get yes, it depends, and there's a couple of things that you reinforced on multiple occasions, which is empathy and assertiveness. When you're in these difficult situations, yes, you've got to be empathetic. Yes, you've got to let people say what they're going to say. But at the same time, you're going to have that level of assertiveness to say, look, if you don't make a decision, this is going to happen. And again, it wasn't a personal, you weren't attacking them personally with that assertiveness. You were saying, this is the outcome if no decision's made. Yeah. This is what's going to happen if this doesn't happen. And it's being very assertive in the outcome of nothing happening, because people can be like ostriches. They'll put their head in the sand. They'll avoid everything. They'll try not to do anything. And really, part of the role of HR is to just be really clear about what will happen. Well, sometimes the only wrong decision is no decision.
Yeah.
And avoiding making the decision. So always trying to.
Did you see the case earlier this week where a teacher hadn't attended work? They'd attended work for 4 years. They'd been employed for a total of 20 years and only worked 4 out of the 20.
Wow.
And that was a result of not taking action. Taking no action at all makes things 10 times worse.
Not for that teacher, it doesn't.
I'm going to have to send you that case, because I'm looking forward to seeing what the results are of these. What we're seeing, very different types of cases coming out of the tribunals at the moment, and we're finding that actually the tide is turning. I would say a lot more. Some employers have become very well prepared, which is a good thing, because that means they're trying to reinforce positive practices. It's not that they're trying to defend themselves, it's that they are trying to do things properly. So some cases have been thrown out, but with this particular case with the teacher, they've been allowed to get away with it for so long, and it's just being passed over with different managers. So it's a fascinating scenario, and certainly not a common one, but I can see that being written in many assignments, James, over the next few years, because it is that unique. But it's not unique in scenario in terms of, oh, do you know what? That's not my problem. I really don't want to deal with it. I don't want to have that conversation. I want to do my work and the bits that I enjoy about my job. Yeah. And that little trouble over there, that can just stay over there. And
that can stay for the next person.
Exactly. And it will be a problem for the next person. So that's just kind of fed on from there. But we do see that head in the sand all the time, and taking no action has absolutely dire consequences. So people feel, well, actually, if that employee leaves after 20 years, oh, okay, they just leave. No, what you're forgetting is the hidden costs that go behind it, such as, you know, the holiday entitlement that they've accrued during that entire time. That's going to be huge. That's not going to be a cheap amount. But doing nothing will cost everything. So always take action in the right way. And if you're not sure on how to do it, have somebody there who does know how to do this and get the proper advice before you go steaming in, because it's actually a lot of tribunals and conflicts and things like that arise from conversations not being handled correctly, either through overcommitment. And the classic one, James, that I hear all the time is, right, we're not happy with this, that, and the other in your performance or your attendance or insert other reason here. But don't worry, it's all going to be okay. Don't worry, everything's fine. So you've then overcommitted and reassured that employee that everything's going to be fine. But then the next moment, they're off again next week and you're like, right, Natalie, this has happened again and I'm surprised. So the cycle continues. So it's really important that if there are niggling issues that need to be dealt with, it's important to nip them in the bud. Don't just let them carry on or let a behaviour continue and things like that, because it will just get worse. The worst part of that is, as a final note, is that then sets the precedent to other employees. So they feel that they can behave in the same way, or other managers say, well, that manager's not doing that, so I'm not going to do it either. And it sets a tone and creates what we call toxic cultures. So we really need to be mindful of how we're handling these conversations and that they're done properly, professionally, and with evidence always behind them.
So we're going to finish, Natalie, we're going to finish with unpopular opinions about difficult conversations.
Okay.
So do you have an unpopular opinion about difficult conversations?
Unpopular opinion. Okay. I think it's probably easy for me to say because I'm having constant difficult conversations. I have them, multiple times a day. I think something that will always resonate with me is what my former colleague always used to say to me. Now, I can't say it because it's an expletive, but the acronym was JFDI. Just Jeffing Do It. So she said, she was always like, I know you really don't want to have this conversation, but you've prepared for this. And I think the more we prepare, the more anticipation there is behind it and the more anxiety that builds from it. But there's no harm in preparing in itself. So I know that that's probably going to be unpopular, is that people just get in there and do it. Actually, there's other parts to it that other managers may not feel so comfortable going in there. So I always take that JFDI approach. And even now, the one thing that I maintain is that as a HR professional, if I was the sort of person that went in on a Friday morning, because sometimes we get quite a few dismissals on a Friday, it's just the day to do it for some strange reason, that tradition remains. So when we go in to those meetings, if ever I took any remote joy from putting someone out of work and out of a living, I maintain that I'm the wrong person to do it. So I would never take joy in dismissing someone, irrespective of whether they've done something wrong or not. But I've worked with many managers over the years that have said, oh, goody, we get to fire such and such today. And they take pleasure in it. And there are still those characters out there. So
but that's the corporate psychopath mentality, isn't it?
Yeah.
The corporate side, the people who, instead of killing people, like to kill people's careers and livings and stuff like that, and enjoy making, going into these big companies and making mass redundancies, and it does stuff for them. And the psychologists that have trapped them.
Yeah.
I think for me, if in terms of an unpopular opinion, I think difficult conversations often clear the air because both sides know normally 80% is just no one said it. And I think actually having a difficult conversation just gives everyone an opportunity to move forward, and not having it, leading on to similar to your point, just keeps that inner dialogue going of, is it worse? Is it better? Can I get away with it? Can I not? And there's just not that clarity of expectation. So I think for me, it's difficult conversations actually are better for everybody. Even if you're the one receiving the difficult conversation or you're the one doing it, everyone will feel better in the duration of time by just making sure that it's clear, because everyone kind of has an idea. If there's targets involved, everyone's kind of got an idea. If there's business performance involved, everyone's kind of got an idea. You can see the stress on the directors and stuff like that. If it's bonuses and stuff, everyone's kind of got an idea of what's going on and how well the business has done. So just the sooner you're more transparent you are, the better it is for everybody. Everyone knows what's expected of them.
Yeah, it's simple, but it's true and it works.
And that's pretty much it. I mean, in terms of difficult conversations, we've gone through understanding what they are, preparations, mindset, essential communication skills, strategies for resolution. I think we spent a lot of time talking about different strategies and stuff like that, and different ways to communicate. Obviously, Natalie's saying just frogging do it. That's her unpopular opinion, which counteracts everything that she said to that point about preparation. But you should prepare. And mine is everyone knows. So just you're not hiding anything by not having the conversation. If anything, you're making it worse.
Yeah.
This has been Let's Talk HR. This has been Having Difficult Conversations. Thank you very much, Natalie from Reeboks HR, for joining us. I'm sure we'll catch you on another one soon. Take care.